All right. How's it going? I'm Casey Barrett. So I'm here with John Fram. He's got his debut novel coming out in 6 days. The countdown is beginning. The Brightlands. We're here today to talk about this new book, which is fantastic. I've already read it and reviewed it. Loved it. And then we're going to get into maybe a more heady discussion about a op-ed that John wrote on June 4th for the New York Times. It was fantastic. It was titled "How White Crime Writers Justified Police Brutality." Needless to say, that swept through the crime writing community and generated a lot of terrific discussion. But first, John, congrats on your debut. It's about to come out.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's called The Brightlands. Comes out on July 7th. And, I can't believe it. It's finally here.
It's surreal. Right before the debut comes out, I feel like you can't quite believe that it arrived, because the publishing process being what it is, it's such a long lead time. I don't know what was the lead time for you in terms of finishing it, submitting it, and then getting the publication date?
Wow. It's weird because I wrote the book pretty quickly. I wrote it in about a year of just like really hard work. And then I think I finished it. I basically wrote it from like July to August. And then we spent all of August, my agent and I, it was a weird process because we did submit it to like one editor for a potential preempt, which I don't know if your viewers know. It's just like the selling industry is really complicated. Like selling a book is just a super weird process. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But then, we hung out for a little bit, sort of tested the waters with it. And then when we had a really positive response, we just sort of went wide. And then I think it sold mid-September, but then that was September of 2018. So it's been about 2 years since it sold.
Yeah, and 2 years, it seems like a incredibly long time. Mine, I think, was almost exactly the same. It was like 2 years and a month.
Yeah.
And when I learned that, I was like, you must be kidding me. Like, it finally sold.
Yeah.
It just feels like it's so far away. But then publishing being what it is, we were just chatting about this before we went live. All of a sudden, you find yourself on a much tighter schedule for your follow-up books, particularly.
Absolutely.
And when's your follow-up next? When's that coming out?
Soon. I can't say. But yeah, no, the publishing industry is weird. I mean, a lot of people do get very upset about it. And I wasn't too terribly mad about waiting this long because I've been, this is my first novel to sell, but like I've been in this game for about 10 years now. I dropped out of school to write, and I knew that this was what I always wanted to do. So pretty much from the jump, like I really studied the industry to understand what to expect. So I knew it was going to be a long time before my book came out. And I think that a lot of writers don't quite appreciate when you are just working on like, a docx file that's like moving around between different email addresses, that this is like going to be a physical thing that costs $30 and it's going to live for a really long time. So I was very grateful. I think right before I sold it, when I was doing my last really kind of frantic round of edits, when you're like pulling a book together, I was friends with a pretty well-established writer who was kind enough to just sort of be like, it feels terrifying and very challenging and drawn out right now. But he's like, remember that if your book sells in any way, like they're going to keep printing it and it's going to have your name on it. So you may as well be proud of it. Right, exactly. So I'm incredibly grateful for those 2 years because it meant that there's just so much stuff you don't know. There's so much stuff you truly do not understand about the process of positioning a book and of really getting a debut into sellable shape that, even though we didn't do as strenuous amount of edits as like some of my friends have had, you never know. Like, and there was definitely one round of editorial that was really rough. So it's like, it's just a long industry for a reason. It's a long lead time for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think once you've gone through all of that process, I mean, I certainly developed a whole new perspective and level of respect for agents and editors and everyone at the publishing house. And I mean, my agent, I think the absolute world of, because the patience required, particularly taking on a debut author, and the amount of time and commitment they have to give you before they see anything in return is remarkable.
It really is. I mean, they're the best. And then you go from your editors into this world of like all the people who are promoting it, like your publicity staff, like your PR team is just, if you're lucky enough to be at a major publishing house, like it's really surprising when you finally realize like how many. That was the other thing that made me much more patient about it, was when I realized like I am not bankrolling my publisher. Like, they're not depending solely on my sales, but a lot of people's jobs depend on this book, turning a profit, doing okay. Like, a lot that contributes to a lot of people's careers. So I need to take it seriously. And I think that that's something that younger writers who are in a rush to get published and are just so excited to see themselves in print. I can't tell you how many people on Twitter I see complaining about their like long ass lead times. And I'm like, be patient. These people are working really hard, and there's a lot on the line for everybody, especially right now. So yeah, exactly. To your point, like, they deserve infinite respect. The whole house, they're just gods.
You've got a better perspective than I had. It's going into my first round of it. It's not an easy thing, and it's very, very hard to stay patient. But let's talk before we talk about the op-ed. I want to talk a little, in specifics about the Brightlands. Like I said, I loved it. I submitted the review yesterday. I think it's going to be posted on Booktrib on Tuesday to coincide with the release. And I know agents do this all the time in terms of reaching for different A-list authors to compare it to and package that way. But I called it in the review. It's Bret Easton Ellis meets Stephen King with setting by Buzz Bissinger. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, no, it's also pretty gay. Yeah, I guess it's got the Bret Easton Ellis is an interesting one. It's really weird too, because like when we sold it, we actually sold it as Twin Peaks meets Friday Night Lights, because when I had first started thinking about it, Twin Peaks' new season had just wrapped, that third season that was so crazy. And I remember being in my agent's office talking about a couple of different projects, and I was like, man, that ending was so dope. Like, what would happen if that was, what if something similar happened to like a Texas football town, and the quarterback goes missing? And he was just like, oh yeah, you should go write that book. And that literally is where it came from. It was just like this offhand idea, and then you don't realize, the subconscious is so weird. You don't realize what's waiting down there to get discovered, because once you have those log lines, they're actually really helpful, because then you can start organizing a lot of ideas around them. But yeah, it's also really weird to get sort of thrown in with all these people who have no idea who you are, like Stephen King and Bret Easton Ellis.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you were on the radar sooner than later. But tell me a little bit about you switch POVs throughout the book with a bunch of different characters, but the anchor of it is Joel Whitley, the older brother of the quarterback who goes missing. Tell me a little bit about him. Do you see yourself in him as someone who I think grew up in a small town Texas and is now in New York City? Was that from a point of personal relations?
Well, it's interesting. So the book is basically like, this guy Joel, he's in his late 20s. He's a queer man who has really done very well for himself since he left his small town in Texas. But he's dealing with what a lot of people my age deal with, where you sort of have started to get on the career track, or you're finding perhaps some degree of success, and you still haven't dealt with whatever it was that so scared you or so disturbed you as when you were younger about like your small town. So he's sort of at the beginning of the book not very satisfied with his life, and he gets a couple text messages from his brother, who is much younger and this very successful quarterback, and the brother is very concerned about something going on. And Joel, the part that I associated myself with most in Joel was just that feeling of when you realize that there's a responsibility that you've been shirking. That was very much Joel for me, because when I was writing this book, like I'm an only child. I don't actually have siblings, but I do have parents who are getting older. And there was this weird moment when I was about 26 where I was like, wow, they're like in their 60s now. They're going to be in their 70s pretty soon. And I remember this very conscious sort of click in my head where I was like, I need to start figuring out how I'm going to like hold up my end of the bargain here. And I think that for me, the kernel that sort of started Joel running was the fact that he realizes after decade of really working for himself that there's other people who might need him, But yeah, the Joel himself is very different from me. I mean, he's very glamorous. When I wrote this book, I was dirt poor, and Joel was very rich, and he was I was really interested in these queer men that you meet at, like, on Fire Island, or in these, like, rooftop parties where they're just all really handsome and all really sort of like struggling to almost look the same, but then they might open their mouth and you realize that they've got this really complex inner life that they're not dealing with or talking about, and they're very smart and capable. And I was like, what if one of those people had to be a hero? And like, what would that lead to? So that's kind of where Joel like started as a character, because I was just always fascinated with these men who I didn't feel myself to be a part of, but they existed, and they clearly are people. So I was like, why are they not getting treated seriously in fiction as heroes, as people who can have power? Yeah. But that's like the power dynamics of queer fiction is a whole other conversation. But Joel was very much this guy where all he had in me to begin with was just this sense of responsibility, and then I would just have a lot of fun kind of imagining myself into this person who was very much not the sort of life that I had the privilege to live in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very New York quality, in a way. I think you see a lot where just because there's a level of success, financial success anyway, there's a big community of very haunted people that maybe they get very successful at a young age, but the hard partying, that I really like the way you were constantly interspersing the fact that, and Joel is very honest and with himself in terms of the partying, where he's popping his Xanax and an Adderall and realizing the hypocrisy of like judging people doing meth down in Texas.
Yeah, and exactly.
I think he had a line that the Adderall is 1 molecule away from meth, but he has a prescription for that, and that's no problem.
Right, exactly. And Joel, I think what made Joel click. Well, what I found when writing him that made him click was when I was like, oh, I mean, this guy he's got to be smart enough to solve a mystery, right? Like, he has to have some sort of intelligence. And I was like, typically that's then going to lead to a degree of introspection. And so it gave him this very interesting moment where he has to sort of figure out his role in relation to Texas. And I think that that's something that maybe it just happens to everybody in their late 20s, but I had a really interesting time as I wrote the book where I started to appraise my own relationship with Texas, even though I'm not doing Adderall all the time, but I still understood that degree of like, you can't really sit too much in judgment of the South. Like, it's very easy to do that, but when you're in New York. And I think that what was fun about Joel was sort of teasing out the way that we're very quick to judge the poor, and especially Southern poor people who have not the best voting habits, but it's like they have complicated lives and really difficult pressures. And I found it really fun for Joel to both sort of be aware of those and also discover more of them as he went through the book.
Yeah. And I mean, Deep East Texas is, it's a place that is, I think, was one of the poorest counties in the country. I mean, you're in a place where it's easy to sit and judge from big cities for these regions that there's not a lot of opportunity for anybody.
Yeah, no, and I mean, like, that's something that I remember when I grew up. I had this weird epiphany when I was, I think, 20, or probably my like late teens, where I was like, the only way that people are going to get a middle class income in this, like in the city I grew up in, was because like the median income, I grew up in Waco, Texas, and like the median income there is about $50,000 at the time. I mean, it's pretty bad, and obesity is super high. College graduation rates are really low. And it's just worse the further into the country you go. And I was like, the only way that somebody could get a middle class income is something that's either going to put them in physical harm, like construction, or something that's going to involve them carrying a gun, like becoming a cop or a soldier. And I was like, this is, as angry as I get at some of the political movements that come out of the Deep South, it's very important to remember, like, they come out of a place of desperation, and this sort of, there is a degree of violence, and it's part of just like everyday life, especially in the South, that it's very easy to, like, my New York friends are always shocked when I tell them some of the stories of like the conditions in which people live when you have no real safety net anymore.
Yeah.
It's brutal. It's a brutal place.
I was trying to pinpoint, I went to Google Maps because, and this isn't giving anything away, but you have characters that take weekend trips to both Galveston and Dallas. So I
Mhm.
was trying to pinpoint someone like was around like Lufkin and I
Yeah,
lived
yeah.
in Dallas, so I was trying to kind of think of like where in that kind of no man's land it was.
It's
Did,
what's that?
I was gonna say, did Bentley have a set place for you, or was it just
Yes.
kind of you have a set idea of what it was?
Yeah, it is. I'm leery of saying it though, because when I was researching the book, I actually was fortunate enough to. There's a couple towns that I had sort of modeled it on,
Okay.
not as terms of any real people, but just like the town locations and like their aesthetic. And there is one town in particular that has a really successful football team and nothing else going on, and it's 3 hours from anywhere, it feels like. And I started following a lot of their footballers on Instagram. And you feel like kind of a sleaze because you're following all these like 16-year-olds and you're like, oh my God, am I part of the problem? Like what am I doing? But they were kind enough, most of them, to speak to me about their experiences, specifically with football. Very few of them were willing to talk about their private lives, which is completely understandable. But I also, because of where the book goes in the last act, I'm afraid of really saying a town because I don't want to get those kids in trouble. Because I remember how guilt by association works down there.
Well, and let's before we move on to your op-ed, let's touch on, without going into any detail about the last act, but I'm curious of your choices in terms of adding a supernatural element to what was, it could have easily been a fully realist thriller, and that supernatural element added a whole different degree of sinister kind of looming evil.
Hmm.
And I'm curious what led you to add that layer into the narrative.
It's interesting. When I had written the book originally, even though I had been thinking a lot about like Twin Peaks in terms of its structure of, I'd been thinking a lot about like, obviously a book needs to be a book, but we can learn some stuff from TV in terms of the way that characters can be manipulated through like a central conflict. So I was thinking a lot about how Twin Peaks does that really well, but I hadn't really considered any element of like the surreal or the supernatural when I wrote the first draft. And I just wanted to write a really, really tight, complicated plot thriller. I was honestly, my biggest inspiration at the beginning was something like James Ellroy, where you get these huge sort of tightly knotted thrillers. And I was like, what would that look like in Texas? Like that was the original inspiration. But what I found in my first round of like really of rewriting it is I kept seeing all these repeating patterns and images where it's like there were certain symbols that just seemed to occur throughout the book unconsciously. And I was like, what if we played with that a little bit? And also I found that when you have a huge cast of characters, it's very hard to unify the suspense, so to speak, right? Like readers often will have, I knew that there was a risk of a reader having a favorite character and then slogging through every other POV that wasn't that character.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I found really useful was by introducing this element of sort of a mounting supernatural presence, you could give everybody one thing to be afraid of, right? And so that gives them all something in common, even when some of their plots are moving in really different directions. And so on the one hand, it was just sort of utilitarian, like it just got a job done. But then once I got to the ending, it allowed me to do a lot of really fun stuff with just like you said, I mean, the great thing about adding a supernatural element is that it helps you sort of cohere your metaphor in a way that crime fiction sometimes struggles with, I feel.
Yeah.
It's very hard in a crime narrative to get across what you're trying to say. And plenty of people do it brilliantly. It's something against the crime genre. A lot of people are good at that. But I found for myself, by introducing a supernatural element, it was just a bit easier to kind of share what I was thinking about and angry about as I wrote the book.
Yeah. No, it's well said. So the fact that you mentioned Elroy as being an initial inspiration, that seems like a perfect transition into your piece about how, quote, how white crime writers justify police brutality. Because I mean, I'm a massive Elroy fan too, but man, that guy, if anyone's guilty of maybe given poor police tactics a pass, I can think of a lot of cases in Elroy's books where that hasn't been pretty.
So the basic genesis of that was like this tweet that I wrote. I was just really angry. It was right when, so it was the Friday before we just tear gas protesters in DC. So it was that period of time that we were just so angry, and the response from the police was just so draconian and so absurd. And I was like, all right, we got to do something about this. So I was just really mad in general. And I try every morning to write, but I just found it really hard to write that morning. And I was like, you know what, this seems like a huge blind spot that I had thought about it when I was writing The Brightlands. Like I was actually very cautious about putting one of the main characters in the book as a sheriff's deputy. And I had issues with that because I was like, as a queer person, I think if you're a queer person with any concept of history, you should be very disturbed at the sight of cop cars at pride parades. Cause I'm like, 50 years ago, we started the gay rights movement by throwing bricks at cop cars. You know what I mean? So it's like, I always, as a gay man, especially a gay man in the city, when you go to these incredibly wealthy, lavish pride parades, I was always like, why are the cops here? Like, I get that like we need like police to maybe guard us from something, but I'm like, why are we celebrating the role of the police? Because already the cops were not our friend. And so we basically strong-armed them into being our friend. And I think that was so I always came toward the cops in fiction very skeptically, because I was like, if you're going to be a queer person with any idea of society, you need to be thinking about that. And I realized as the book was about to come out, then like 2 years after I first had that thought, not many people were talking about this. And I was like, you know what, let me just like write a tweet about this. And I didn't even think about it. I just tweeted it because I had like 300 Twitter followers at the time. Like I didn't really have an audience. And I tweeted it and like turned my phone off and like went to try to do my work. And then about 2 hours later, I get an email from my agent where he was like, have you looked at Twitter today? And I was like, what are you talking about? And it had just gone like viral very quickly. And this tweet about just basically asking like why we had allowed the police as an institution in this country started as slave catchers. I mean, some of the earliest documented like organized police in this country were catching slaves. And I was like, why do we have an entire lucrative genre around these people? Like, why are they like one of the cornerstones of like fiction? And so that was the tweet. And then it just sort of blew up, and it was very, honestly, going viral was really distressing because like you just get so much attention, and I didn't actually feel like I knew enough about the cops to say that, but I didn't actually feel like I could go much deeper than a hot take on my own. And so it just triggered this like long day of just like a lot of research and sort of contemplation. And then through it all, my publicist like, secured me, like the New York Times wanted to see something about it. So it just led to this really crazy weekend of speaking to people and researching. And then I published it, and I honestly stopped thinking about it, but the response has been really nice.
Yeah, and for good reason. I mean, I printed out just because there's a couple spots that I circled myself, and you talk. I mean, the piece, it's the core is about crime fiction and that genre, but there's also a lot of great mention of police TV shows, which is a massive industry in itself. And I mean, the long history, you mentioned Lethal Weapon, Dirty Harry, and these movies that I grew up on, but in retrospect, they're not aging all that well. But you have a line at the beginning where you're right. Why are whites repeatedly rediscovering the fact that people of color have always known that police are almost as dangerous as criminals that protect us? And as a writer of crime fiction, I've become convinced that white writers like me bear some responsibility. And I mean, I immediately circled that. And then while I was going through the piece, I'm not saying I was congratulating myself because I write a Private Eye series where the police are treated extremely cynically and really on the periphery. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe I'm not guilty of this. But sure enough, you reach a point where, say, inevitably, when the police show up after something awful happens, when we as white crime writers, that's usually a sense of like, okay, safety is returned, or a sense of calm is returned because the cops are here now. And right away, like I have to cop to that, because even though I might be treating my law enforcement character cynically, when they show up after something awful happens, that's generally shows a return to the threat hasn't been, subdued.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was Steph. Yeah, that was Steph Shaw who really came through with that. She was the one who made that point, which I really respected. I had thought about it, but she really articulated it very well. I think it's something that, P.D. James also spoke about this to some extent, though she was very conservative. I mean, like, she wasn't, an evil person, but she was very conservative, and she was very upfront about the fact that crime fiction to her was about sort of order being restored, right? Like this idea that the detective character is a hero because he's sort of, it's almost invariably a he, is the arbiter of order in a chaotic universe. And as much as I respect that concept, and I think it's definitely possible to do that in the context, like you said, of like a private eye story, where a private, like somebody outside of like the power structure is subverting the power structure. I think that it's very dangerous to forget that the police exist to support the status quo. And when that status quo survives based on the exploitation of people, they're not heroes. Like they're just not. And this present moment has shown that very clearly, that individual police may not be so bad. Like there are really like great cops. I will not pretend there's not. But as a whole, they are trapped in a system. If we're being generous, they are trapped in a system that does not allow them to do the right thing in general.
Well, particularly we're talking about certain segments of society where, let's face it, we're in a position where we're going to be able to not be nervous driving down. I'm in the Catskills right now, driving on a country road, simply by virtue of the way I look. And that's something that, I mean, hopefully there's a lot more awareness of that rising, but, I've never been nervous if I speed through a village where the speed limit goes down in a village in a speed trap. But, there's...
Yeah, you're not going to get shot for it.
Yeah, there's plenty of folks that rightly need to be very, very nervous about that. And that's something that certainly in crime TV shows and crime books, that's not really touched upon all that often.
Well, one thing that I am very grateful for, and I'm not in any way taking credit for this, just that shortly after the piece came out, we started to see, and I'm not the only person who wrote about this. Like, I don't want to pretend like I'm some sage from the mountaintop. And also most of the pieces from super smart writers of color who were very generous with their time and had a much better take on it than I did. But right after this happened, Cops got canceled, Live PD got canceled. Like a lot of these reality shows that are just sort of, it's honestly super interesting if you think about it, because shows like Cops and Live PD that are pretending to take a sort of neutral stance and just like document the police, like the life of police. It seems like a really great example of how neutrality toward a system of oppression is going to side with the oppressor. And like we can get into a long conversation about how, actively the police are trying to exploit Black and people of color, like communities of color. But it was interesting all this time to sort of look back critically on Cops, which I used to watch all the time as a kid. Like, I don't know why I watched. I mean, it's just like, it was like watching a train wreck. But looking back on it, I realized that by doing it, just the period of art that doesn't take itself seriously and doesn't take itself critically, I think needs to end. Because that was something that I've noticed for the 90s and 2000s. We had so much that just tried to remove editorial. I felt like something like Cops is a bad example of this. Blue Bloods, a lot of these TV shows have this habit of not actually speaking about what they're speaking about, so to speak. And I think that I do give some crime fiction a pass privately. In my head, I was always trying to figure out like who gets away with this, like who deserves a break. And I think there are crime writers who are a bit more aware of what they're doing. But I think that there is, as a whole, I kept being asked by people to talk about certain crime writers, and I just got so sick of it, because I was like, if I say, oh, this writer or that writer is maybe the exception to this rule, there's such an audience of people on my Twitter who were just like desperate for me to say, oh, but this guy's okay, or that guy's okay, this person that you like is okay. And I was just like, no, I'm not going to do that, because they may be good in one book, but like I haven't read all 30 of these books or 50 of these books or however many books this guy's read. I'm not going to give you that comfort. I'm going to say, and I'm also not going to say stop reading people, but I'm really tired of readers not examining what they're reading and writers not examining what they're writing, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and to just circle back for a second, the shows have been canceled, and the Washington Post, I thought went maybe a little bit too far. After your piece appeared, there was an editorial calling for basically all cop shows to be canceled for the time being until things were reworked. that's, I don't find that particularly economically realistic, particularly when you're talking about a franchise like Law and Order. And I've been a Law and Order obsessive fan for over 20 some odd years. I love watch all of it, but I do think there, when you look at it, and one of the writers that you talk to in the in your piece, there's really a danger of self-editing on shows like that, because they're, for people outside New York maybe that aren't familiar with this, Law and Order is like, and they're renowned for employing like every out of work actor in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, they're they're beloved more than for just the shows. They're beloved because they are this like institution of production and job creating and celebrating New York, but they have to work with police by definition to make this show. So if they make the cops look a little too bad, then that entire structure, that entire edifice of the Law and Order industry starts to crumble. So,
yeah, it does. It's a mess. I mean, Law and Order, I think, yeah, as far as canceling all the shows go, I get the sentiment, and I did like that piece. And if I'm not mistaken, that was written by Alyssa Rosenberg, who I quoted in my op-ed. She's been doing a lot of really great research into the representations of violence in specifically in shows, like television shows. But no, I mean, it's Color of Change did a really great report on this that I quoted. And God, I think they've figured out that something like 70% of primetime entertainment falls somewhere within the genre of the procedural. Like, it's huge business for the networks.
Yeah.
So yeah, as far as the feasibility of canceling all of them, that I'm not so sure about. One would pray that their ratings would suffer on some of these shows, because like the worst are as far as Color of Change did this really groundbreaking study where they examined how often a hero, like a main character, is depicted doing something unconstitutional and getting away with it or having it benefit the plot. And it was really intelligent. They did this really smart ratio, basically, of like trying to establish different shows. And the worst offenders were Blue Bloods and SVU.
Really?
And those are both shows that have, I mean, Blue Bloods just makes a mint. I know SVU, like it just keeps chugging along, but I'm over it. And then, people were coming and telling me about certain actors who are friends with certain members of law enforcement because of this. Yeah. And that was a whole element that I didn't feel qualified to get into. But yeah, it's something, if I can tie it into crime fiction, like I said in the piece, a lot of crime writers do depend on the police for access, for ride-alongs, for advice on guns and forensics and all this stuff. It's really useful to have a cop who's going to talk you through it. But I'm always amazed at the crime writers who are thanking cops in their op-eds or in their acknowledgement pages, and yet over and over and over are writing the novels that have nothing to do with the day-to-day experience of most detectives. You know what I mean? Like I'm always astonished that you read, and by virtue of being commercial, one of these books needs to be out of the ordinary. It can't just be like another kid shot in gang violence or whatever. But like the fact is I wish I don't know how to thread that needle economically. And I don't know if there's an elegant way to, but the fact that novels over and over are depicting these crazy love crimes and these complicated plots and these deep schemes of like money and blackmail and all this stuff, like that happens. But any cop will tell you, like any experienced detective will tell you, that happens like a couple times per career. And the fact that, a crime novelist makes a career writing year after year after year of those, I think that it has the habit of numbing a white reader to the reality that most of the time cops are cleaning up the mess left behind by like capitalism, basically, of like poor people killing each other because of desperation. So I think that it's kind of amazing to me that crime writers will talk to the cops and use those resources and work with them so much, and yet they seem committed to churning out books that have nothing to do with the reality that a cop experiences, or very rare instances will a cop have a case nearly that complicated.
Well, and I mean, almost by virtue of the police procedural specifically, the case, the crime story, you're not going to write a book about crime prevention, because the murder that didn't occur, the rape that didn't occur, it's not a story. So you're talking about crime solving, And when I looked up this stats recently, the crime clearance rate in the U.S. is so much lower, I think, than anyone realizes. I mean, there's a 40% chance of anyone getting away with murder.
Yeah.
There's over a 50% chance of anyone getting away with any kind of major felony. And that includes all the knuckleheads, all the crimes of passion that are open and shut, all these desperate addict crimes like that are reasonably easy to solve. So, just the structure of the police procedural where this case is going to be solved by the end, and there's, say, a year where the detective you can depend on, and they catch what is in reality a once in a lifetime case, but they have one every year and they always solve it.
Yeah.
That creates quite a disconnect from
totally
reality.
Yeah. And I mean, I will give crime writing credit, especially in the last few years. I have seen more of a willingness to explore ambiguity. So like not to excuse or accuse anybody, but I do like that we're seeing more of a world in which ambiguity occurs. That said, I read a book, like a sort of, really solid procedural by one of the big dogs, and I was pissed. Like it ended ambiguously, like it didn't tie anything together. And I was like, this is really lame. So I get why aesthetically it's very challenging to make one of those novels work if you depict it realistically. Because yeah, the realistic case is either when I first started writing crime fiction, I ordered one of the big like homicide investigation textbooks. It's like called Practical Aspects of Homicide Investigation. And it's fascinating. And it's really grisly and it's really unpleasant. And it's interesting to read the case histories, because very frequently as you read these case histories, they always know more. They always have a suspicion of who did it. But it's very rare they can prove it, even rarer that they can get it to a DA. And it's just like, I'm not saying that like the genre needs to end, and I understand the pressures, especially if you're a writer whose contracts and economic model depends on putting out a book a year. But I'm just really hoping that this moment will cause specifically white writers of crime fiction. I mean, some people need to retire, but like hopefully the ones who keep working. I hope that it inspires people to stop. I don't know. I kind of wish we could take like a 1-year pause on crime fiction from white people and like, or from like the police procedural genre. But barring that, I hope that it allows people to be a bit more critical and to just really, really think hard about what kind of cases you're centering and what kind of message you're sending. Because yeah, like you said, that half the times nothing is ever going to get solved.
Yeah, and that limits the storytelling. I mean, my hope is that this opens up a lot more perspectives and POVs from these stories. I mean, I've always been partial to private eye stories, which are inherently an outsider that's skeptical of the law and order framework, but also just the police procedural, particularly from the point of view of a grizzled older white cop who is tired of playing by the rules and just wants to go get them. That's something that I'm not sure it's going to age particularly well.
It's not. I think it's also important to remember that so much of you can draw a really straight line between that mindset of I don't need the rules and I'm going to like wing it and go ham, and this sort of, this is a whole can of worms, but it's a mindset that to me, there's a pretty clear link between that and the sort of radical neoconservative model that we're living in now, where there's no respect for regulation, there's no respect for government, there's no respect for the concept of reining in one's own behavior. And I think that it's important for people to think very critically about what you're saying when you're telling readers that they can, break a few legs to get things done, because what we're clearly seeing in reality is that when that's carried out, very little is done except a few people get richer. You know what I mean? Like very little is actually achieved by breaking like the law.
Right. I wanted to ask, we don't have to, give passes to certain writers who write Hero Police versus other ones, but one that fascinates me and someone I've always really admired is Michael Connelly. And I personally prefer his books written from Jack McAvoy is one of his lower tier series characters where he's an investigative journalist.
Oh
And
yeah.
and I prefer those to the Harry Bosch ones, although I really like Harry Bosch and the series I really enjoy as well. But I prefer when he's writing not from the point of view of police. But
Right.
His credo, the Harry Bosch credo that's often repeated, is everybody counts or nobody counts, which is just by virtue like is grounded in humanity, and it's great. It's kind of like the thematic center of who Harry Bosch is. But now you look at a phrase like that, and my first thought was that could be easily co-opted into the all lives matter versus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah, I mean, listen, it's Connolly is incredibly talented. He came up in a lot of conversations, and I do not want to spit on his career at all. He has done some incredibly impressive work. But yeah, I think it's a very privileged standpoint. My problem with everyone matters and no one matters is that it creates an algebraic equation that presumes that X equals Y. And clearly we are living in a world where that equation is far more complicated and far more imbalanced. So yeah, I think it's something that it looks great on a Subway ad for Bosch, the Prime series, and like I get it, and I love the sentiment behind it. But there is this particular habit. I'm not saying it's exclusive to Connolly. It is all white people, myself included. There is this very, very particular habit of looking at injustice and saying, how does this affect me? And how can I say something smart about it? When I get as an artist, you need to say something. Like we're making art for ourselves. We're making art to make a living. We're making art. And you have to engage with the world around you. But seeing a sort of pithy slogan like that, to me, just it's a lovely anchor under a series. But I hope that we can see a bit more complexity into that, of saying, the people who already matter the most, what can they be doing to help other people matter more than this sort of like 1 + 1 - 1 sort of easy in and out solution. But that again, I don't want anyone to say I'm coming for Connolly. I think he's done some really great stuff.
Yeah, and it's tricky. I mean, I'm sitting in my little office and I glance in my bookshelf and see plenty of my favorite writers who are guilty of perpetuating these sentiments, and I certainly don't want to. I'm not around to pick fights with some of my favorite authors who've done some incredible work, but I'm thinking a lot harder now, where maybe I'll pick up something they wrote in the early 90s or 80s or whatever, where in the age of Lethal Weapon. And I remember when I was a teenager, Lethal Weapon 2 was like my favorite movie when I was like 15 years old. Yeah. And going in to watch Mel Gibson, in anything now makes you think twice. But the Lethal Weapons, are a very, very good example of something where it's like, man, that's just because Danny Glover's his partner does not make this policing okay.
Yeah, those movies are textbook, but My Friend is Black. I mean, they're pretty bad. Like I think it's important to the 80s and 90s are an interesting time period, because what you were seeing was an explosion of wealth in this country and a consolidation of wealth, and a sort of very deep rejection of the revolutionary potential of the 60s and 70s. And so a lot of the fiction that really dominates that period, and you can even see this up into the early 2000s, it's very much a sort of a quailing from that brief moment where the country looked like it might change something. Like, oh God, like on the literary side, you have something like American Pastoral by Philip Roth, which is just, rich straight man feels scared. And it's just like that, not to denigrate the fact that to say something really pleasant about it, the best I could say is that there is this understanding in a lot of good literature that the only way progress is going to be made is for certain people to lose some power and to lose some comfort. And I don't buy into this sort of new liberal idea that capitalism is not a zero-sum game. It absolutely is. The only way we are going to make the world more just for Black people is arguably through reparations. But even without that, you are going to need to see some serious like redistribution of wealth. And that's going to mean that a lot of very wealthy people are going to lose a lot of money. And so I don't like this idea that we do see lately in the sort of comforting Obama liberalism, that we're just like passing around like a few pieces of pie or something. Like, it's going to be a really painful process for people who are going to lose a lot of houses at the very top. They don't need those houses, but it's going to be painful. And so I do understand when you look at a book like American Pastoral or certain pieces of crime fiction that are very afraid of the loss of the status quo. But that's embarrassing about so much literature, specifically by straight white men, is that it sees everything resembling justice and actual, like, anything that kicks in the door a little bit, they are almost inevitably painted, those characters who are advocating for that are almost inevitably painted as just like out of their mind, like revolutionaries. And it's very rare to see a piece of literature appraise revolution and social change with anything resembling characterization in reality. It's one thing, like, next time you pick up a book that deals with anyone who's any kind of like anarchist or radical, just kind of ask yourself, how seriously is their humanity being taken? Because something that I noticed with a lot of fiction, especially as I became a bit more radical in my mid-20s, was I was like, where are the people like me who do have very real misgivings about how like any kind of actual change is going to take place? And I'm not out here advocating for stuff to get blown up, like, but I did meet people like that. Like, I had friends briefly in Austin who were really intense, and I was like, where are they in fiction? These nuanced, complicated people who are just very angry and very hurt, and very scared, because all I saw were characters like, again, Pastoral or something, where this guy is just like, my daughter's just gone nuts. And you're like, oh my God, okay, like, where just, there's got to be more. There's got to be better. So yeah, ask yourself that too. Not just how are people of different races being treated, but how are people outside of the political establishment being treated?
Yeah. What are because you quoted some great ones in there, and you mentioned Steph Cha earlier, who's it seems to be deserving of every bit of praise she's getting with Your House Will Pay. Has just been nominated for the award, and she seems like a great example. I'm curious of what are some other recent work. It doesn't have to be in the crime mystery genre, but ones that stand out for you in that sense.
I mean, as far as like trailblazing, let me think. I mean, Walter Mosley, I keep coming back to. I mean, he really is. He just put out, I haven't read his newest one. He wrote a book about 2 years ago called Down the River Under the Sea, the Sea, that I think it's probably the best detective novel I've read in the last like decade. I think it's just exquisitely good. Let me look at my shelves. What's tough is right now, I'll be completely honest with you, I haven't had the chance to read as much because I've been dealing with so much promotional stuff. Steph Cha is definitely up there. S.A. Cosby's new book is great.
Well, that's been getting a nonstop promotion. I feel like every time I open Instagram, there's another picture of it.
Yeah, no, he's well deserving of that. And then let me think. There's a book called A Beautiful Crime by Christopher Bolin that I really liked. And it's not anything like what we've been discussing as far as like revolutionary or like kick the doors down. And it's about an interracial gay couple in Venice who go to sort of con a wealthy billionaire out of some, like, basically to sell him fake antiques. And it sounds very asinine, and part of it's just very lusciously written. But what I do love about it, without giving anything away, is that it takes this sort of Patricia Highsmith setup, because Highsmith, she was good. I mean, as far as queer characters go, Ripley is great. And I mean, he is very much a type of queer man that I am very well acquainted with, Tom Ripley, the talented Mr. Ripley. But in her books, like, they often end in insidiousness. The idea is very often rooted in this idea that his queerness, it sort of feeds into this larger system of corruption and rot that takes hold of those books. And they're fascinating to read. But what I love about Bolin is that you think it's going to do that, and then it veers off into this really beautiful direction. And you realize that, like, queer love and queer happiness and queer success feel really shocking and feel really remarkable. Because when you get to the ending of that book, without spoiling it, it does get very violent. It does get very unnerving. But there's something really incredible where you see two gay men happy, and you realize how seldom that occurs in a piece of genre fiction. So I would say that, Bolin's A Beautiful Crime and Blacktop Wasteland, and obviously Your House Will Pay. There,
Mhm.
so there is great stuff being written, and I'm really excited. I know Rachel Housel Hall has a new book coming out. I haven't had a chance to read The Galley,
Mhm.
but yeah, I mean there are great voices coming. It is a great time to be reading crime fiction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, just personally, my opinions on the news media these days covering, whether they're covering the protests or the pandemic or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think whatever side of the media you're watching, you're not getting the the, the real story. So
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. My opinion, it's never been a better time to be reading and writing crime fiction and finding new voices, because just by virtue of the news cycle and you know the 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 lack of objectivity that seems to dominate now.
Yeah, it's funny. Like for about
But
2 minutes there, you froze for a bit, but I think you're back. I can see you.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I get what I heard what you were saying. I think it is ironic that, I mean, Twitter for years has been just the great dumpster fire of American civilization. And then for about 2 weeks there, they were really like, there's RuPaul's Drag Race, the TV show, and then there's like this Untucked is called the supplemental thing, and it's a lot of backstage drama. And like the slogan of that is always like, if you're not watching Untucked, you're not getting the full story. And for a minute there, Twitter really was that. I mean, Twitter was the only place where you would see just the length and breadth of police violence in this country. And it was an exciting time. And it is exciting how, I mean, I think it's a great time to be writing crime fiction, great time to be writing horror, anything that's sort of showing people what queer people and other people have known for a very long time, which is that there's nobody looking out for you and everything is scary. And like, finally straight people are just like getting on this train too. And they're like, wait, what is going on now? Like, this is terrifying. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
God bless.
I guess you can't be among them.
Yeah, no, it's a weird time to be alive.
Yeah. It's been fantastic, fantastic chatting. I can't wait to read your next work. Mentioned, because you were talking to me before we went on, just mention on here how, because it's just insanely prescient, this new story you're writing is about the cruise. You want to tell us about?
I mean, I can't say very much. I can't say very much, just because I need to sell this one first. But basically, a while ago, I was like, what would happen if people were stuck on a cruise ship and then this COVID outbreak broke out? So which I would not wish on my worst enemy. So if you're watching this from a stranded cruise ship in the middle of the Atlantic, you have my condolences.
It really does sound like worse than solitary confinement in a lot of ways. If you were stuck out there,
you're basically trapped on a floating Walmart. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah. Well, I'm psyched to read whatever you write next. Like I said, Brightlines was fantastic. Congratulations. I wish
Thank you so much.
Every bit of success.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.